so when we're experiencing shame, it is important to bring an aspect of like, you know what, I see why I did what I did, and I feel so much compassion for that part of me that really relies on this. And I feel compassion for maybe even the shame. Like the shame's trying to keep me safe. It's just here to keep me accepted by my people, by the people I care about. And I feel compassionate to the shame that's just here to keep me alive.
So for our listeners, we have a super exciting guest today. Rachel used to be a member of our team at Fight the New Drug, and now you're doing amazing things. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a LCSW, which is licensed clinical social worker, and I used to work here while I was in graduate school, and then after I graduated, I worked with Fight for was like 2-3 years, I think. And then I later went on and started a private practice. And so since then I've been doing that, working with lots of different types of mental health disorders, but definitely pornography, I would say, is one that I work with quite a bit.
So can you explain how pornography can impact an individual's mental health and well-being?
Yeah. Well, I would say the first way that probably is the most invasive and also a way that we don't talk about a lot, although Fight does a great job of talking about it, is shame. And anything else I would say after this, I think shame is probably the core of the issue of what's going on, especially when it comes to the mental health aspects. And part of that is because shame is something that we really don't talk a lot about. Like, I don't think many kids had shame modeled to them in the way their parents said, like, looks like you're experiencing shame.
Right.
And so because of that, it's really challenging to identify. And when there's shame, it really impacts the way that people feel about themselves, but then also it impacts the way that they act, because that's such an uncomfortable, like hiding, withdrawing feeling that people will do whatever it takes to get rid of shame. And so it kind of becomes this cycle of maybe other addictive behaviors or pornography itself that brings shame.
That's a good point. I think a lot of us don't think about how to identify shame.
Yeah.
Like, it's not something probably that most of us were taught as kids, like
Right.
you mentioned. So I guess what's a good starting place for someone to identify whether or not they're experiencing shame in the first place, before even determining whether or not that's fueling a habit with pornography?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a phrase in the therapy world of naming it to taming it. And so I think the first thing to identify is how does shame show up for me? Because I think it is different for every person. Sure. But maybe questions I would ask is, how does it show up in my body somatically? So maybe it's like I feel my stomach drop, or I feel my cheeks get flushed, or I feel like my body language gets smaller. And also maybe things like, what are my urges? So do I want to like actually withdraw from people? Do I find myself lying? Do I find myself, wanting to hide? And then also, what thoughts am I having? And so I think when we can identify what shame looks like, then it can become easier to be like, oh, I think what I'm feeling here is shame. And that really is probably the most first and important step too, knowing if this is something someone's struggling with.
Yeah, that's well said. So if someone is experiencing shame and maybe isn't aware that it is shame, but it is something that's fueling a habit with pornography, what does that look like? And kind of what's the process of that? How can shame negatively impact that cycle and really fuel that cycle?
Well, it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, at least in my opinion, because I think a lot of times people use pornography as a way to obviously help themselves feel better, whether that's through emotional regulation or a way to hide. And so if someone's experiencing shame, and I'm not sure how in-depth with shame you want me to get here.
As in-depth as you want, honestly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so like shame is actually really fascinating to me, and it's something that I've studied quite a bit. And I think this may help provide context, because shame generally starts when we're kids in our childhood. And that's because kids just don't have the ability yet to see things from other people's perspective. So if their parent snaps at them, they can't say like, Mom, I understand I made a mistake, but you were like, that was really unkind what you said. Mm-hmm. The kid just can't do that yet. And so the only thing they're left with thinking is like, it's because I'm a bad kid. I'm a bad person. Right. And this story starts to really take place, and it becomes this lens. So this child is seeing maybe their teacher has a an outburst at them, and it's like, yeah, it's because I'm a bad kid. And so then as they get a little bit older, that feeling is so distressing and so disturbing to, I think, everybody, but especially kids who don't yet have the ability to, again, like I said, see things from other people's perspective, that they find ways to help themselves regulate. And as we know, pornography, often there's a really early exposure, and it's a really successful way, I would say, at help managing shame.
Right.
And so what's so tricky about it is then it helps manage the shame, they feel better, but then oftentimes it just brings that shame right back up after. And it's just kind of this like just this cycle that continues.
Right. And for someone maybe who's experienced this process in their life for a long time without early exposure, it's become a habit perhaps through their teenage years. When they get to be an adult and maybe can see something through another person's perspective, often individuals who are in relationships maybe where they're hiding a pornography habit or something, shame can be part of that process or play a role in those relationships. What have you seen with regard to how shame can affect, even as an adult, when someone's kind of been on this cycle?
Ooh, yeah. Well, shame is so pernicious. Is that what the right word? It's like, it's so sneaky because by design, it is saying withdraw, hide, don't let anybody see, lie. And so because of that, I think that people feel that way in relationships to other people. Like, I want to hide this from other people, but also from ourselves. It's really challenging when we're feeling shame to be able to say like, ooh, can I like sit in this feeling of shame? Yeah. Why am I feeling this way? Because our like brains are literally saying this is really dangerous to us. Right. So we have to do whatever it takes. And so if these foundations have been laid in childhood, it doesn't matter if now that the child's an adult and can see things from another perspective. It's like, it's just kind of this, like this pathway has been paved. So, I mean, absolutely it's possible to be able to understand shame a little better. And I don't even know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, you are. And I think this is so helpful and such an important part of the conversation around pornography and porn's harms, because we often, I mean, we're educating and raising awareness. So with that, we're inherently just like shouting statistics at the world on social media all of the time. And it's, I think, easy when those things are taken out of context to let that feel shame or to experience shame as a result of maybe having a habit and then seeing that information. And so, you know, as well as our followers, that we do talk about shame a lot. And I think it's important to contextualize this conversation as much as possible with shame. Because I think it's important for people to know that even if they do have a childhood wound of shame and are experiencing shame with this habit, that there's also hope, which I do want to ask you a little bit about that. Like, if someone is in adulthood, in a relationship or not, experiencing shame about a pornography habit, or finding that the shame is fueling the habit, or both, and they want to make a change, where and how can they do that?
Yeah, I think the very first step is just acknowledging that there is shame, you know, of just saying, you know, maybe there's even a chance this is something that I'm experiencing. And with that, there's so much research to show that, if anything else, the antidote to shame is self-compassion. Now, self-compassion is really interesting because I think we don't fully understand it. A lot of times there's, at least I think we often think of it in terms of being like, well, I'll just tell myself like, you got it, buddy. I understand why you did what you did, and just keep moving on. And I think that's definitely part of self-compassion and aspects of it. But I'm sure we talked about Kristen Neff. She was one of the leading, I would say, researchers of self-compassion. And one of the things that she talks about is why self-compassion is so beneficial is because then it opens the door to change. Yeah. So when we're experiencing shame, it is important to bring an aspect of like, you know what, I see why I did what I did, and I feel so much compassion for that part of me that really relies on this. And I feel compassion for maybe even the shame. Like, the shame's trying to keep me safe. It's just here to keep me accepted by my people, by the people I care about. And so I feel compassionate to the shame that's just here to keep me alive. Yeah. And then what that helps do is it kind of like helps relax the shame a little bit, so that then the person can ask, well, so now what? Yeah. You know, so does this align with my values? Does this align with who I want to be? And if not, what do I want to do? And because the shame's relaxed, it allows space to be able to ask those questions.
Yeah, that's so well said. For someone who is maybe unfamiliar with the idea of self-compassion, obviously Dr. Kristen F. does have like amazing resources on self-compassion. But for someone who this is new information to them, where could they start to develop that self-compassion or even wrap their head around the concept of self-compassion? Where can they begin?
Well, I think most of us are, it's a little bit easier to start from a place of how would I feel if someone else was going through this? Like we're generally a lot kinder to people that are not ourselves. And so, I mean, I know that this is kind of like really popular in the therapy world right now, but I think it's very helpful to think about it in the way of, can I even like write a letter to myself as if I'm talking to a friend who's experiencing this, or a child, or someone that I really care about? And that can help start to tap into the self-compassion. I also think self-compassion is like a muscle. I don't know if anyone's going to feel like, wow, that felt really natural. Like it's going to probably feel uncomfortable,
right,
and maybe even bring some anxiety. Like the person may feel like, oh no, if I'm compassionate to myself, then like I'll never stop looking at porn. I'll just get away with anything, which by the way, research shows it's actually the opposite. But I can see how there may be like a lot of anxiety around this idea of being compassionate. So I would say also anticipating there may be some resistance inside. So there may be parts of us that feel like, this may not be safe for us to do this. Shame has gotten us pretty far, and so we're going to keep going with shame. So it's just practicing and expecting discomfort.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that it is a muscle and you have to exercise it like anything else to maintain it.
Yeah.
So for someone who's struggling with a compulsive porn habit, even if they've identified for themselves that they want to change, or maybe are looking for, into self-compassion or into helping themselves, what is a way that they could disclose what they're going through to another person that's healthy and productive for them and would aid them in that healing?
Yeah. It's funny because I think that this is probably one of the most important parts of someone's journey with this. Like, I'm not really sure if someone can do this on their own because shame probably wouldn't let them. But to be able to have the courage to tell somebody else is really, I think, just a tremendous first step to the anxiety, to the shame, to be able to say, like, I know that all parts of me are saying absolutely not, but like in the act of in itself of telling someone,
Right,
rather than like somebody else knowing, I think it's the act of courage of telling
right,
is really what helps overcome a lot of that shame. So when deciding who or where to tell, I mean, of course, I think these are important questions to ask. So obviously someone that I trust, someone where there's not like a power difference, or someone that you may feel that the person could exploit this information.
right,
That's all given. I would also really have it very clear in your mind what you are wanting to make sure that this person understands. So that might be having some education. Like you might need to educate the other person about pornography.
right,
It also may be showing or being very reflective of what your personal journey with it has been. And so I would say like coming pretty prepared
right.
as far as what it is that you wanted to share, and be very, very thoughtful about that. I would also say finding a time and a place. So by place, I think is really important. If, let's say you're sharing with a partner and maybe you and your partner have a place where you tend to disagree or have arguments, maybe picking a new space, like a neutral zone or a space you've never been to before. And then also timing. This is probably not something that you want to spring on someone, but to say, there's something I want to talk about with you. Is there a time that we could talk about this? And then the last thing I would say is letting the other person have space to have their own reaction to it. Like they may be really upset.
Sure.
And I think that could be understandable, especially if this is like a breach of trust or a breach of an agreement that the both of you had. But I think it's really important to allow for that space, because to expect them to not react, I mean, it'd be nice, but it's not realistic.
Sure. And I think that that's such a good perspective to have about coming prepared with your intention of why you want to share. Because I do think maybe for some people, like feeling like they need to share because they've they're just needing to get the secret out there, which there is courage in doing that, but that might not have as much clarity in leading to a productive conversation as knowing, I do want to speak about this because I don't want to hide under the shame anymore, and I do want to share this information, but also I would like the end result to be support or accountability, or to be able to say, I recognize that this has hurt you in this process, and I would like to be able to help heal that wound or that trust or whatever that is. So I think that's a really helpful perspective. Is there anything that if someone were struggling with pornography, I think the fear of the unknown reaction is a reason a lot of people don't disclose to, especially a romantic partner, where you mentioned it could be a violation of trust or an agreement. Is there something that someone disclosing, particularly to a romantic partner, should consider to make sure that their romantic partner like has capacity and is able to hear this information?
That's a really good question. I would say that when it comes to trust and like just trust in a relationship, especially if this is something that you know there has been a breach of trust, or that this goes against something that you two have decided as a couple, that my opinion at least is that it needs to be talked about. Right. And even if it feels like this other person may not be able to hold that, I think that what is far, far, far worse is keeping something a secret or hidden. Yeah. I think you can leave up to the other person how much they want to know. So you can just say, like, I'm just going to say very basically, this is what's going on. I'm happy to answer any questions or fill in any details you want. But I also want you to feel like you can lead how much you know or how much you want to know.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. Many of the people we are speaking to at presentations in schools, online, are younger people, are teenagers. A lot of the conversations we've had are often applied to adults or people in marriages or serious long-term relationships who are older. But what about for young people?
Yeah. I think I would actually say it probably still applies. So if I'm the person who's disclosing and I'm disclosing to a friend, I think it's important to still have an idea of what am I hoping for. I think what can often happen is the pain gets so great, like the shame becomes so overwhelming that it kind of like bursts out and it becomes a way to regulate it. Like, I just got to tell somebody.
Right.
And that can be helpful, but I think a much more productive way is to have it very clear. Why am I telling this person? And making it clear, like, hey, I'm sharing this with you because I trust you and I'm looking for help. I'm looking for resources, or I'm looking for, I just need you to hear this, or I just need you to know. On the receiving end, I think I would say just responding truthfully of like, I know that this is really hard. And if there's like, if there's like level of discomfort, like I feel uncomfortable with this, I'm grateful you told me, but I'm not a person that I think would be good to have this conversation with. Be honest about that, because I think that trying to fake anything could lead to probably more damage in the end.
Yeah. And especially maybe for younger people to know, like, it's okay to encourage them to talk to a trusted adult or someone else, instead of feeling like you have to take that burden on yourself.
Because this is a adult problem. Yeah. This is just a big problem.
Yeah. That's great advice. Can you talk a little bit about the psychological reasons behind a compulsive porn habit and how they could lead to addiction?
Yeah. So I first want to say that my guess is that for people who are struggling with compulsive porn use, there's probably a lot of co-occurring other, not diagnoses. What's the right word I'm looking for?
Like mental or emotional.
Yeah. Whether that's going to be like anxiety, depression, maybe even traumatic experiences, PTSD. And so I think that's important to note, that I don't know if there's someone who's going to struggle with pornography that doesn't have anything else going on at the same time. But what we know about the brain, I mean, it's just this whole reward system. And so especially when we're talking about this idea of shame, which is this like, withdrawn, it kind of reminds me of like this depressed feeling of like a depression, like being pressed down. So when there's dopamine being released in the brain, and I know that we have a lot of material on this whole process, but when there's dopamine released in the brain, it's just like a little bit of a pressure release of that. And so that in itself becomes incredibly rewarding, especially for someone who's experiencing shame, is because it's just like it's a relieving feeling from the shame. And so like I was saying before, it just kind of creates this cycle.
Right. So if someone is experiencing this shame or is experiencing maybe their compulsive porn habit is being used to fuel that dopamine reward center, they're trying to get out of it. What are some ways that they can develop healthier habits or healthier coping mechanisms to transition out of that cycle?
So one of the things that I a way I like to think of this is kind of like a car. So if you have a car and you're driving down the road and it blows out a tire, you have to stop on the side of the road.
Right.
You can't keep driving. And so at that point, you're addressing the issue, which is I need to put a spare tire and get my tire fixed. Right. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about issues like pornography, we're thinking, when I'm like already in the middle of the cycle or I'm feeling a lot of shame, what can I do to stop it? And I think that there are definitely techniques that can be helpful, which I can talk about in a minute, that can be helpful of like, hey, I'm on the side of the road. Like I'm in the midst of this cycle. But I think what's even more important is to back up a bit and say, what are the maintenance things I need to be doing on my car, even before I'm off on the side of the road, or maybe even before I'm driving. So this could be like car or tire rotations or oil changes. I'm trying to think of like what your maintenance things
Getting
are.
Getting new tires when you need them before winter. Or
exactly.
Whatever.
Exactly. And so I think that these are actually probably even more, I don't want to say important, but helpful. And so the first thing is to be able to come up with daily non-negotiables of these are the things that help my nervous system not be so activated.
Right.
So whether that's like, hey, it's really helpful for me to journal, and that is a non-negotiable. I have to do it every morning. So there's like this idea of morning pages where people journal for 4 pages without stopping. Like that's an excellent way to start the day. That can be incredibly regulating. Or maybe it's like listening to music while going for a walk, or yoga, meditation, whatever that may be. Those are the non-negotiables.
Right.
And those are the things that I think the maintenance helps keep the cycle happening, or as frequently or as intensely. When it comes to actually being in that cycle, so now you're off on the side of the road.
Right.
I think meditation is really challenging at that point.
Sure.
You're already really flooded. You're overwhelmed. It's hard. Like literally the prefrontal cortex is mostly shut down in the way you're not thinking things through critically. And so at that point, there have to be really small, simple things to help pull yourself out of that experience. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, those can be things as simple as like, literally, I'm just going to take this ice cube and hold it in my hand.
Right.
Like, I'm just going to focus on something else in this room. Or I'm going to like count backwards or whatever it may be that can just like have a little bit of a disruption.
Right. Pull you out of the cycle of like craving the dopamine, getting it through that hit in that way. Just anything else to remove you from it. But you made such a good point. The upstream approach to this is to build those habits that can keep you from getting to that point in the first place, because you're avoiding that nervous system kind of spike or heightened state that you might be in if you're always on the side of the road with all of your tires.
So, I mean, this can even be of like, am I like looking at the way that I'm breathing, like just throughout the day? Might not even be activated, but like, how is my breathing? Am I breathing up here in my chest, or am I breathing down deep into my belly? And even those differences can really impact the way your nervous system responds to if you're feeling shame.
That's a really good point. I think probably like, I don't know, a lot of people on social media or in pop psychology or whatever hear about their nervous systems, but like probably a lot of us don't actually know like exactly what that means. What does that feel like? Like what does it feel like to have an activated nervous system? I know we talked about the physical somatic feelings of shame, but how could someone identify if their nervous system is, in addition to how they're breathing, if their nervous system is maybe hyperactive?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple different ways. There's this idea of, I think when our nervous system is activated, we're in the fight, flight, freeze. So you're going to see symptoms like breathing up in our chest. In fact, it's interesting because if you look at infants are belly breathers. They will breathe very deeply into their bellies, and their breaths are generally slower but lower. And that's like using the diaphragm space. Right. Most adults, in fact, if you're paying attention right now, you're probably breathing up here in our chest. I was just thinking about where most of us are breathing up in our chest. And it just allows space for like quicker breath. But the problem is even the difference in those breathing literally indicates to our nervous system of like, I have to be ready. Right. Like if I am activated, I need fast, quick air, right, to be able to do whatever they need to do.
Run away from danger.
Yes, right. Exactly. Exactly. But it, like I was saying, it indicates to the brain of like, we need to be like all systems are on alert. Right. As opposed to if I'm focusing on breathing down deep and slow, that signals to the brain of like, hey, we can be in this rest and digest space. Like we're in the space of like, we can relax it's a bit more settled. So I would say that a lot of the symptoms are more somatic. So paying attention to breathing, heart rate. If there's like kind of this like feeling of like, I got to get things done, like kind of like that anxious energy. Right. It's really hard to sit still. So if you think about just, if I were to sit still right now for a minute and not move a muscle, would that feel torturous to me? Torturous? I don't know.
That feels right.
Yeah. And if it does, that might indicate that like, hey, my nervous system might be pretty activated right now. Right. If you're really jumpy, those can all be indications that your nervous system's activated.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think good to note, because if you are, addressing that as a trigger and making progress, you'll be able to also kind of track that progress by noting, is your nervous system calmer, which I think is reassuring if you're on this path of healing or recovery.
Yes. Yeah.
Love that. So therapy. Let's talk about therapy. First question, a lot of people who are experiencing a compulsive work habit or wanting to make a change in this way sometimes consider therapy, but we hear a lot from people that they just don't even know where to start. Yeah. So for someone in that position who is interested in considering therapy as a resource, what would your advice be to them on where to even begin?
Yeah, well, I think it may be first important to understand what is it I'm wanting out of therapy. Yeah. So what are my goals? Because I think, speaking as a therapist, there are a lot of people who come to therapy and they say they want to change, but really what they want to do is just talk each week. And that's fine. Sure. But I think it's becoming very clear of, I want to see this therapist because I want to learn skills. Right. I want to have someone to be accountable to. I want to have I just want education around this, or I want to process some trauma that I experienced, or like so I think having a clear idea can really help point the direction of where you're wanting to go. And honestly, if someone's just like, hey, I don't have anyone else to talk about this with, and a therapist would be helpful, I think that's fine too. But It's important to be clear on that.
Yeah, to know what you want out of the experience before you start.
Yeah. So once that becomes clear, I think it can be helpful to understand different therapeutic modalities, and so figuring out what some of those modalities are and what resonates with you.
Do you mind talking about a couple that might be helpful specifically for someone dealing with pornography habits?
Yeah, well, the most common is going to be CBT, and I think that's definitely the most researched. In fact, I think CBT is considered to be like the grandfather of all of all therapy modalities.
Just cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, which really is this idea of challenging disordered thoughts. Right. And so those thoughts may be the thoughts that come up because of the shame, and then it's like attaching behavior. So what are you doing? And that whole process. Right. So I think that can be definitely just, you're not going to go wrong with CBT. Right. And there are some therapists out there who are just pure CBT therapists. I think other ones that can be helpful are things like mindfulness-based. Mm-hmm. Personally, I really love mindfulness-based because it really helps bring back into this present moment idea, which most of us are not in the present moment. And so this idea of coming back to the present moment and being okay with what's there. So if I'm feeling shame, this type of therapy will really help you to almost like, I'm feeling shame in my body, and you know what? I'm going to just sit here and let the feeling of shame just be here. And I'm okay with it because it's not going to kill me, right? So it's really learning how to do that. There's also, you can do acceptance commitment therapy, which is ACT, and that one's really helping you understand what your values are and being able to move forward based off of what those values are. let's see. You could do, there's like motivational interviewing is maybe a type where it's kind of the same thing, where you have a therapist that really is skilled in just pretty much asking you questions to help you understand what is important to you, maybe even see the errors in your thinking, but it's all through this like space of the therapist just asking you questions rather than telling you things.
Right. If someone's porn habit maybe is rooted in a trauma or something from an earlier time, are there specific types of therapies you would recommend to someone in that instance?
So another form of therapy that can be helpful, especially for trauma, is EMDR. It's really interesting. Do you want me to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think for someone,
works?
I love EMDR therapy.
Yeah.
10 out of 10 would recommend it to someone, but I think a lot of people are like, what's that? What does that even mean? We just said it what it is, and we don't even, that's not clear.
Well, EMDR is fascinating because to really be brief on how it works is... when someone has an experience that happens to them, usually there's this, like the actual logical event, what happened, and then emotionally how they felt about it and the meanings that they made. And for most of us, when we sleep, the brain can take those two things almost like a zipper and like zip them up, and then the brain will store them and process them.
When you're in your REM cycle.
When you're in your REM cycle, exactly. When there's a really big event where the emotions were so high, the meaning was so high, oftentimes I would say shame is so high that the brain, when it's sleeping, it gets stuck. It can't quite zip that up. And so because it gets stuck, it doesn't get processed away.
Right.
And it's almost like it stays there in the brain and it becomes very easily activated or triggered. And so this might look like flashbacks or anything that reminds you of that event or like events, then the brain's like, oh no, it's happening again. So what EMDR does is it mimics what happens during your REM cycle of your sleep, which is basically just eye movement. But also
like bilateral
bilateral stimulation.
Like when you're in your REM cycle and your eyes are kind of shifting.
Your eyes are going back and forth.
Being stimulated.
Yes. Yeah. So when your eyes are going back and forth, that's what's happening. It's just like zipping that up. So EMDR, the traditional way is having that client move their eyes back and forth while they're thinking about or talking about that experience, but also can look like just like anything that happens from the left side of the body to the right side of the body. So left, like tapping your knees left and right. I personally prefer holding these little tappers that will buzz back and forth in your hand. So what that can do, and honestly, I think EMDR is helpful for people who haven't even experienced like extremely traumatic things. I think it's just really helpful at helping the brain process honestly, I would say shame. Like any event, big or small, that happened when you were a kid or a young adult or whenever, that your brain just kind of gets stuck on this loop for, and it helps it process it and put it away. So I would recommend EMDR for anyone.
Yeah, same.
I will say this, EMDR can be incredibly activating and triggering. And if the person's doesn't quite have the skills or ability yet to help themselves regulate after, I maybe wouldn't recommend it quite yet. First, like really working on building some of those skills.
So for someone who's maybe listened to this description, thinks, oh, that might be helpful for me, they can pick a therapist who is qualified to do that and able to do that, but that therapist would work with them to know when they would be ready to do that, probably.
Ideally, yes.
Ideally, yes.
And I think that would be something you would ask your therapist. If you're going to see EMDR therapist, what are the ways that I know that outside of the therapy room, I can be okay? Like, can we build some of those skills first?
And I do just want to ask this before also going back to how to identify a therapist, because these are all helpful things to consider of what type of therapy, etc. For someone who is in a relationship, maybe a marriage, or, you know, if this has impacted the relationship and they're also interested in doing a couples therapy or something like that, what recommendations would you have in that consideration?
As far as like looking for a couples therapist?
Yeah, in terms of like how to find a therapist that might be a good fit for a couple who is wanting to address this issue.
Yeah. I mean, I would say finding a therapist who is just maybe educated about pornography and is also really skilled in understanding what the main issue is. Because it may not even really be about pornography. It may be about trust. It may be about like on both sides. And so
Right.
I think finding a therapist that can really help identify the core issues.
And for someone who's maybe never seen a therapist before or found a therapist before, how do they do that? How do they go about that process?
Oh, okay. Yes. So I would say, honestly, the best bet's to ask for recommendations.
Yeah.
Just to ask, like, does anyone know of a therapist that they liked? It doesn't even have to be someone who's going through the same thing, but just, yeah, do you have a therapist you like? There's also a lot of avenues like Psychology Today. You can find therapists in your area, and you can even narrow down your search by like if they're male, female, what modalities they're trained in, maybe even what their religious background is in, if that's important to you. So I would say that's a good place to start. The other thing too is the most important thing in therapy is the therapeutic relationship. And there's been so much research done that what leads to the best outcomes in therapy is that relationship. Yeah. It not even is exactly the skills of the therapist. It's just what's this relationship. And so for me personally, when I see a client that I know that we're not a good fit, I will say that.
Right.
Because to me, it's so much more important that they get the best help they need. And if I know that we're not clicking and they confirm it too, then it's like, we got to help you find someone's better. Right. So with that, I would say really trust your gut of, is this person someone I can trust? Yeah. Is this person that I feel understands me, understands my issues, who listens, who provides good insight, who asks questions? Those are all really important things to consider.
That's such a good tip. And this has come up on the podcast before. Often people will say, I'm afraid to like open up to someone to test if they're a good fit. And then what if they're not? Then I have to start all over and do it all again. What would your advice be in terms of like testing that out and figuring that out before, you're into your deepest trauma and someone saying, actually, I just think this isn't a good fit and having to start over? What would your advice be?
Yeah. Well, most therapists will do consultations, and I would absolutely recommend doing those and coming with thoughtful questions. Yeah. I personally do consultations, and when a potential client comes to me with really good questions, for me, I know that they're ready for change. Sure. Like I know that they're taking this seriously, and I also know that they know what they're wanting. And so for me, that's very, very helpful when I can hear what questions they are asking. But also, I think it helps them decide, like, do we click or do we not? Right. And what I would also recommend is, if possible, to see more than one therapist in the beginning. Right. So, like, I'm going to just schedule with, like, these 2 or 3, 4, however many therapists. I'm going to go to all of them, and whoever I feel the best with, then I'm going to stick with my gut on that one, and I'm going to go ahead with.
That's something that for some people could be cost inhibiting, but also worth considering if this is something that you're going to spend a lot of time with this therapist. You're essentially, it's like dating, right? You're going to see what's the best fit for you before you make that lifelong commitment. I think it's a great option to be able to know that it's okay to approach a couple of different people and maybe keep things lighter even for a couple of sessions or for a first session for a consultation. Yep. Before kind of diving into everything when you feel like you found someone who's a good fit.
And I do want to add this, because I think what can happen oftentimes in therapy is we are a very like ghosting culture. And so if like a therapist says something you don't like or does something you don't like, we're just like, I'm just not going back. But why this therapeutic relationship is so crucial is because it's a place to be able to practice this skill. So what I think is like just probably the best thing that a client can do is to come to the next session and say, like, honestly, I didn't like how you said that. That was really hurtful to me. And can we talk about that? Yeah. That will be the telltale sign of a good therapist, is if they can say, like, tell me more. Yeah. Because I want to repair this with you. Right. There's been a rupture in our relationship and I want to repair this. Now, if the clinician gets really defensive, that's going to tell you all you need to know. Right. But if the therapist is willing to repair and say, like, this is why I said this, but also I see how that was hurtful, and doing that repair work, that makes a huge difference. So I will say, trust your gut, but also be willing to have the tough conversation with your therapist.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. I obviously, I love therapy. I do therapy. I have many friends who do therapy, and we often talk about this idea that, like, sometimes people feel like they have to, like, be presentable a certain way to their therapist, or they don't want their therapist to judge them, or they don't, like, there's an idea going into therapy that's like a fear of judgment from this stranger that you don't know, and then you tell them your most intimate, issues in life. would your advice be to someone who's maybe concerned about, like, is my therapist going to judge me?
They probably are, to be honest. Like, they probably are going to have judgments.
Yeah.
And I think that what to understand, though, is that it's that therapist's job to ask themselves, is this something that's going to impact my ability to work with this person?
Sure.
And, like, for example, if a client is sharing something that is actually personally triggering to me, let's say that's something I have experienced in my life,
Right.
I'm going to probably be feeling triggered. Now, it's my job to either tell that client, like, maybe even be honest. Like, honestly, what you're talking about right now is personally activating to me. It's not your job to take care of me, but I want to address what's here in the room.
Right.
Because the client's going to be able to feel that if the therapist is having a reaction inside. Most of the time, though, probably what the therapist is doing, if they are judging, is they are thinking, like, okay, first of all, I'm going to take note of that. Why is this something I'm judging this person about?
Right.
That's something I need to address on my own, and I'm going to bring it back here.
Right.
I wish I could say all therapists did that.
Sure.
but I would say, like, in the end, the worry of being judged, I mean, you probably are being judged, but not in the way you think.
Sure.
Not that they're thinking,
like I think people often feel a fear of disclosing the things they want to work on most because they're afraid of judgment about those things. For example, someone who has a lot of shame about a pornography habit might feel that in terms of fear of disclosing that. Like how would you respond to someone who's afraid in that way?
Honestly, I would say to maybe even start off of, I'm really nervous to tell you this.
Yeah.
Because I'm afraid you're going to judge me.
Yeah.
Ooh, if I were to hear that from a therapist, first of all, I would be thinking, like, I need to check myself. Because if they're feeling from me that I'm judging them, I need to ask that. Are you feeling judged by me? And if you are, we need to talk about this. And I want to be honest with you, and I need you to be honest with me. Yeah. But then also, that also says, like, just like what a space for vulnerability, you know, of practicing that vulnerability, of saying, like, this is really scary for me. And even though I'm afraid you're going to judge me, I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah.
I know that there are things we're afraid to say. But the reality is, truly at this point, I think I may have heard it all. Like, I don't know if there's anything anyone can say where I'd be like, what?
Sure.
Like, honestly, I think for me, it's like, not to, like, dismiss or not to dismiss anything, but partly it's like, I mean, honestly, the other three people have said the exact same thing.
Right.
That I saw right before you. And it's not to, like, minimize it, but it's just saying, like, I don't know if there's anything that could be said that is, like, going to bring up judgment or,
Right. Like the things that so many people feel and experience, they're not alone in, basically. Yeah. But we just think we're alone in those things because we have shame, largely.
Right.
For someone who has maybe gone through therapy, feels like they've kind of accomplished some goals in therapy, obviously they would get this information in that process. But for someone who's maybe unable to have therapy, it's not accessible to them, they can't afford it, are there tools that generally people would learn through the process of therapy, especially combating a pornography habit or sexual compulsivity? Are there tools that you would recommend individuals try to learn on their own? I know you mentioned journaling a little bit earlier and some breath work and things, but could you just kind of name a few things that could be helpful for people who either don't have access to therapy or have done therapy and still are looking for tools to kind of continue this healthy journey? Yeah.
A way to start that can be really helpful is just tracking the pattern, tracking the cycle of what happens. And so, first, like, what's the initial trigger? And it may not even be something that's related to pornography, but, like, honestly, I just woke up and I had a headache.
Right.
Write that down and I would say, be really, really, really curious. Almost like if you were a scientist to yourself, like you had your little notebook and you were watching, like you're an anthropologist and you're watching this culture you didn't yet understand. And so you're just taking notes, no judgments. It doesn't matter why at this point, you're just writing down what you notice and taking all of that data and all that information, because it will point to the areas that need help. And once you can understand what those are, then it can help you narrow down where you're getting stuck, why you may be getting stuck. Although I would honestly say why probably doesn't matter quite as much here in the beginning. I think and I think it can help provide context, but really it's just the what is happening.
Right.
And I think we want to get into the why, and personally, I think that can kind of derail the progress. But to understand the what is most helpful. So once you understand that, then it's in the beginning, it can be like, okay, so what do I need to do to interrupt this cycle
Right.
or this pattern? So like at this point when I'm feeling this, I know I need to do this.
Right.
And I think that can be really helpful initially. And hopefully over time that the spaces will grow so that the interruptions will feel bigger. And it may be even in the beginning, it's like I could only interrupt it for 10 seconds and I was right back on. But I think that's still progress.
That's progress.
And so you're just trying to build up those spaces. What I would say though, and this may be a little woo-woo-y, but I think it's actually really, really important, is in the end, if we're to break down what is happening, I think for pretty much everybody on this planet, is we're trying to escape these unpleasant feelings, whether that's shame or anxiety or depression. And we're so fearful, our entire systems are so fearful of feeling this way,
Right.
that we will do whatever it takes. I think one of the most beneficial practices is mindfulness, but not in the way that we think. I think a lot of times we think mindfulness is where I'm going to focus on breathing and I'm going to like watch my thoughts pass. There's this time and a place for that. But what I mean by mindfulness, it's this stillness. It's, can I sit still and whatever is there, I'm going to watch it grow so big that I think I'm going to die. And then I will still not move. And once that, like the crux of that comes down, it's like exposure therapy to yourself.
Yeah.
Of saying like, hey, I actually survived that entire wave of shame.
Yeah.
I actually thought I was going to die, but I survived it. There's research that emotions only have a lifespan of 90 seconds. But why they last longer is because we attach the meanings and we do whatever it takes to get rid of them. Right. So when we can sit with these swellings, one of the ways I like to personally practice this is I'll lay very, very still and pay attention to just the sensations of my body, which one of the first things I usually notice is I have an itch somewhere. So like, let's say I have an itch on my knee, and this is the same idea, the same practice where I'll just watch the itch, kind of like I'm looking at it from a third party perspective, and I cannot touch the itch. I cannot itch it. I just watch, and it'll get really, really, really itchy, and then it will start to go away. And then I'll notice there's an itch on my foot, and it's the same practice. It's just like this practice of like, whatever happens, I can survive it. It's not like pushing against, it's like almost a surrender to,
Right.
in a way. And truly, I think that is one of the most regulating things someone can do, because it's just showing the nervous system, we survived, we survived.
And there's like proof to yourself in that. You build trust with yourself and knowing, oh, I did that. I went through this feeling and I didn't die. I survived this thing that I thought was too scary to ever dive into it. And actually, once I was there, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Or whatever that process looks like, you build that trust with yourself to believe, oh, I can create change actually.
Exactly.
In a way that I think is really motivating. It can be really motivating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You have so much knowledge to offer on everything, but especially how therapy and therapeutic practices can be helpful for someone who's struggling with pornography. Is there any hopeful word you would leave someone with who maybe is in kind of the depths of a challenge with pornography, or anything really that's maybe steeped with shame or whatever it is, to know that there is hope on the other side?
Yeah, I will say this, that anybody can change, and that things can get better. But I also would add that everything you need to be successful is already inside you. And I think a therapist can be helpful to point to those things, but you don't need a therapist to heal. And so I know that sometimes going to therapy feels like a barrier for actually getting or feeling better. And personally, I think therapists are always going to be really helpful to help lead to that. Right. But everything is already there inside. And I would also say just trust yourself and trust your ability to do this, and that you're also not alone. I think every person on this planet is struggling with the same thing, truly, and that we're all just trying to manage our own shame, and we just have different ways that we're doing it. Yeah. And I think there's something kind of comforting in the fact that it's not just you, even though shame is saying it is.
Yeah. And also that plenty of people have found their way out of those shame spirals and into healthier ways of existing, and that you can do that too, right?
Exactly.
Like, we're all experiencing the challenging things in similar but different ways, and we can all experience the hopeful and healthy things in similar but different ways as well.
Absolutely.
Because of desensitization, many porn consumers find themselves consuming more porn, consuming more often, or consuming more extreme forms of pornography. In fact, according to a 2016 study, researchers found that 46.9% of respondents reported that over time, they began watching pornography that had previously disinterested or even disgusted them. Get more fast facts about the impacts of pornography and exploitation at ftnd.org/fast facts. That's ftnd.org/fast facts. Research has demonstrated that overcoming a pornography habit is absolutely possible, and that over time, pornography's negative effects can be managed and largely reversed. So, are you ready to quit porn for good? Meet Fortify, an online recovery program that has helped tens of thousands of individuals around the world stop their porn habit in its tracks. Fortify's free, science-based recovery platform is dedicated to helping you find lasting freedom from pornography. You can connect with others, learn how to better understand your compulsive behavior, and track your recovery journey. Join Fortify for free today at ftnd.org/Fortify. That's ftnd.org/Fortify. You're not alone. Recovery is possible. Quit porn for good with Fortify. Fight the New Drug is an affiliate of Fortify and may receive financial support from purchases made using affiliate links.
Thanks for joining us in this episode of Consider Before Consuming. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects, using only science, facts, and personal accounts. Check out the episode notes for resources mentioned in this episode. If you find this podcast helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a review. Consider Before Consuming is made possible by listeners like you. If you'd like to support Consider Before Consuming, you can make a one-time or recurring donation of any amount at ftnd.org/support. That's ftnd.org/support. Thanks again for listening. We invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.